So just to, well, you've actually already introduced me, so that's great. So I work for a company that's called CGI. It's a big IT services company, global, 70,000 people working for us. And I lead the architecture practice in the Netherlands, and you can see some of my hobbies here as well. Maybe when you saw the topic of this talk, your first thought was, oh no, not another maturity model. But maybe not, because otherwise maybe you wouldn't have been here. Let's look at the mother of all maturity models, which is the CMMI, of course, not coincidentally also born here in Pittsburgh. At the SCI, Guidelines for Process Integration and Product Improvement. Capability maturity models focus on improving processes in an organization. They contain the essential elements of effective processes for one or more disciplines. So you see that this definition contains the word process twice. And ever since, I guess, you know, the agile movement, the word process has been sort of deprecated. But that doesn't mean that there's no use for maturity models. Because, you know, there's still stuff that we would like to do, the stuff that we would like as architects to be able to do, or our architects to be able to do, stuff that we want organizations to find important. And, you know, we would like to measure that for two reasons. First of all, to identify where we can do better. And the second, of course, is that when we try to improve the way that we're doing things like architecture, we want to know if we are making any progress at all, right? What is the return on investment of our efforts? So here you see a picture that I've made using our maturity model, where you can see, for example, if you have a baseline measurement, and then you can see whether we are actually improving the next year after we have done maybe training or other interventions in order to improve on what we're doing. So, and actually this was mostly driven by organizations that I am helping to improve their architecture function. And they asked for some way to measure, you know, those improvements, and that's where we got to this maturity model. It is based on the risk and cost-driven architecture approach that we have been applying for, I guess, almost 10 years now within CGI, which is an approach consisting of 18 practices and 4 principles for agile solution shaping with a quick feedback loop, focusing on the economic reality and very scalable, and basically also focusing on the business goals of doing architecture, which we consider to be improving your risk and cost control. We've done a lot of publications about this, and I've talked about this, I guess, about every year for the last 6 years. So, I mean, it's maybe a little bit new compared to the previous years, but isn't that new? I was inspired for this maturity model by 2 people and their work. The first one is Philippe Kruchten, and he wrote an article, What Do Architects Actually Do? A few years back. And basically, he came down to a very simple model, which is, okay, architects basically spend 50% of their time actually architecting, you know, creating an architecture. And the other 50% they spend on communication. And roughly you can divide this into 2 parts, the incoming communication and the outgoing communication. The incoming communication from the stakeholders, what do we need to do here, and the outgoing, providing information to the people who have to realize that architecture. The other inspiration was Owen Woods, who about a year ago, or maybe it was a little bit longer ago, did a survey on LinkedIn where he was asking architects how they focused their attention. And his model, which I won't go into detail about, but also inspired us to create this maturity model. So what does it look like? Well, it is based on these 5 things which we call responsibilities. The 5 responsibilities of the architecture function in an organization. So I try to be very careful and not say that these are the 5 responsibilities of the architect, because in some organizations, they may choose not to have one role that they call architect, that they assign all of these 5 responsibilities to, but it should be pretty clear that these things need to be done somewhere in the organization in order to get good designs and good risk and cost control of the delivery process of the solutions. And they start basically with understanding context, because architecture is context. Yesterday, a bunch of us did a workshop. It was called Journey to Architecture Island. And the purpose of the workshop was to identify what are the key things that every architect should be able to do in order to be a good architect, you know. And in the end, you know, after hundreds of post-its and stuff like that and lots of discussions, what do you think the answer to that question was? What are the key things that an architect should do or know? The answer was, it depends. We found that answer by actually applying, you know, first of all, having an elaborate process of identifying important stuff to architects, and then dividing up into 3 groups, which each had a different context, and selecting the things that we thought that in that context the architect should do. And the thing was, there was hardly any overlap between the 3 contexts, which basically tells you that architecture is context. So the first thing that every architecture function should do is understand the context. Then we have another responsibility of the architecture function, which is modeling. This is actually the oldest responsibility of the architecture function. When we started to talk about architecture as something that that is related to software, we have some, you know, publications from Mary Shaw, David Garland, architecture as an abstraction, architecture as a set of structures. And you can, you know, look at the work from the SCI, and this is basically the definition of architecture there. And this is architecture as a modeling responsibility. However, about a decade later, there was a new point of view about this, which was that architecture was a set of design decisions. Owen Woods has the nicest definition about that. He says architecture is the set of design decisions that if you make the wrong ones, your project gets cancelled. That was his definition of architecture. Those two, of course, are not completely independent from each other, because it's those design decisions that goes into the model, and it's actually the model that helps you make the best decisions. So there's a lot of interaction between those two. So that's about, we're now talking about 2005 when these publications came about, but then a few years later, some of us started to ask the next question, which is why? Why would architects, why would we want to do this? Why would we want to do modeling? And basically, and the people I guess published most about this were George Fairbanks and myself. Well, the reason, there's business goals behind architecture, which is to manage or to get better control of risk and cost. You know, you can do without architecture, but then, you know, you run more risks. That was basically our point of view. And that adds 2 more responsibilities to this, which is validating those models and those decisions, and actually also making sure that the architecture is fulfilled, that it's execution, basically. So that brings us to this model of 5 responsibilities of the architecture function. Now, we can play around a little bit with this model. And what if we forget, oh, sorry, I forgot the most elegant definition of architecture. Architecture is about the important stuff, whatever that is. Famous article by Martin Fowler. I'm saying it's elegant, I like it a lot, but I think it's completely useless in practice because it doesn't tell you anything. Anyway, so what if we don't do some of this? What if we leave some of these responsibilities out? Well, I have, you know, seen a lot of organizations and how architecture is done there. And this is one of the caricatures that I run into, which I call the Waterfall Wasteland. And it's not a coincidence that we have an ivory tower here to illustrate this, right? We don't make decisions. You know, we are there, we are architects, we don't make decisions. We only advise management as to what we think is the wisest thing to do, but we don't do that. And fulfillment, that's actually the next step. You know, that's after we are done. You know, we can have a perfect design, fully validated, great models, and if it doesn't work out, you know, that can never be our fault. You know, that's basically the caricature of the Waterfall Wasteland. And I think has been quite a lot of this historically, and I think that's maybe one of the reasons why when the Agile movement was looking for an enemy, it was so easy for them to point to the architects and say, that's the dark side, right? We don't do that anymore. And that led to actually the opposite of the Waterfall Wasteland, which I call the Agile Outback. Let's not fulfill these responsibilities. We don't think they are important. Actually, modeling, nah. The best architectures emerge from self-organizing teams. It's on page 2 of the Agile Manifesto, right? So we don't do modeling. Actually, modeling is dangerous. You know, you might upset the Agile gods, and your architecture emergence miracle may actually be not come true if you mess with it. So don't model. And this is actually where one of my favorite sayings of George Fairbanks came from. He was talking a few years back in one of these conferences about modeling behind closed doors. You know, it was frowned upon to model, but people thought it was necessary anyway to become successful. So they made sure that nobody noticed, and that maybe the Agile gods wouldn't notice either. Anyway, validating. Of course, we don't validate our architectures because you learn much faster by actually doing it and trying it out. So fail early and fail often. Right? That's what we want to do. We don't validate. So we get into the Agile Outback. Of course, if you have a self-driving car, failing early and failing often may be a little bit dangerous. And we have a lot of other examples of that. It may not be safety related, but it may be business related. So we want to steer clear of the Waterfall Wasteland and the Agile Outback. We want to find our way in between those. So maybe just a little test. Who of you has ever worked or found themselves or their organizations in the Waterfall Wasteland? Okay, that's quite a lot. And how about the Agile Outback? Oh, it's the same people. So we've seen both sides of how not to do it. What we want to do, of course, is do it all. And I recently reviewed a paper where they called this the Goldilocks zone, right? Trying to have just enough architecture and just enough agile and stay in the middle of that. So paying balanced attention to all 5 responsibilities, that's the key to becoming agile. And also making sure, of course, that these responsibilities are correlated. You know, we can divide and conquer. We can say, okay, you guys do the modeling and we'll make the decisions. But if you don't talk to each other, of course, you will have the wrong decisions and the wrong models. And once again, it doesn't matter what you call this, how you have organized this, as long as these 2 prerequisites are fulfilled. I have seen many euphemisms for the architecture function because organizations realize that they have to do it, but they don't want to call it architecture because that is associated with the dark side. So I have seen things like master builder. I have seen pathfinders and all these kind of other terms just to avoid calling this the architecture function. Any other nice euphemisms for architects you guys have run into? No? Okay, if you remember one, just come and tell me at the break. So I'm a collector. So right, so now we have actually built a maturity model on top of these 5 responsibilities because, you know, if you can measure how good we are at fulfilling these responsibilities, then that will tell us also a little bit about how good we are at doing architecture. And in order to be able to do that, we have associated them with things that I've thought a long time about what I should call these things. My first attempt was calling them practices, but they are not all practices. Some of them are attitudes or some of them are just process, actually. So, but I've ended up calling them behaviors. And that's sort of, it's kind of vague, which I like because then it covers all of these different categories of things. So for example, understanding context has two behaviors that show you how good your organization is at understanding context. First of all is how effective is the communication with the stakeholders. And the second is how good are you at managing the knowledge that you get out of this. Similarly, for making decisions, we have 5 behaviors. First of all, you have to have this attitude that actually your decisions as an architect are your primary deliverable. Then you have to know how to prioritize those decisions. You have to also justify them and document them in some way or other. And then you have to think about the timing of the decisions. Are you not making them too early or delaying them too long? And are you actually consciously thinking about that? And who is making the decisions? Very important, right? Some decisions have to be made centrally. It's the highway, the freeway that Brian was talking about earlier. And some decisions you would like to be made decentrally because they have better local knowledge there and you get better decisions that way. It's a key behavior that you think consciously of where your decisions are to be made. Then we have the modeling, and basically there's 2 important things there, behaviors. First of all is that you have a visual model of the context, which of course is very much related to this context knowledge management. And second is that you have models, visual models of the solution that you're trying to design. Validating has only 1 behavior, checking that the architecture fulfills the stakeholder needs. And then we have fulfillment, which has 3 behaviors that are key, that tell us how good we are at that. First of all, that we recognize the architectural runway, meaning that we are not just looking at functionality, but that we are also looking at technical debt and architectural improvements. The second one is architecture debt control, that we are dealing with that and not shoving it under the carpet. And the third one is that is about anticipation. How far into the future are we looking? Now, I don't have time to really go into detail about these behaviors, but tomorrow afternoon, I think, there is a 90-minute tutorial where you will get a form, and those of you who attend that, and we will go in detail into all of these 11 behaviors, and you can get the opportunity to score yourself, and we'll do it together. And so if you're interested in doing that, just come to my session tomorrow. For now, I'll just tell you a little bit about how we measured how we did the measurements. Well, we have created lists for each of these behaviors of evidence that people are doing it right and counter evidence of that people are doing it wrong. For example, the first behavior or the first lists are about the behavior of stakeholder communication. Business stakeholders with sufficient mandate are actively involved in architecture activities. That is evidence that you're doing it right. And the opposite, the counter evidence, is business stakeholders are only involved at predefined approval moments, right? We're creating the architecture documents and then we're sending them to them to put a stamp on it. Or they're only involved in requirements gathering and everything that happens after that, the design itself, the trade-offs, etc., doesn't involve them. And so we have this whole list of evidence and counter evidence, which tomorrow I will discuss for all of these behaviors. Now, and then the way we measured it in these organizations is for each team, we did 5 interviews with architects and stakeholders, because the architects are not always equally able to be objective about their own performance. And asking open questions and, of course, referencing these examples. And then we basically have 5 score levels. 1 is that, we never do this. And 5 is, it's a complete habit. We don't even think about doing it anymore. It's so ingrained in the organization. And then we have 3 levels in between. And we applied this model, actually a predecessor of the model that I just showed, in 3 organizations. We assessed 9 teams doing 45 interviews in 2 industry sectors. And what we found was that there is actually a wide range of maturity levels. Even within one organization, you know, one department or one team was doing a much better job than others. We ran into some interesting anti-patterns. Well, most interesting, of course, the Agile Outback and the Waterfall Wasteland, which we both encountered, even within the same organization again. And we had two lessons learned. Basically, first of all, do not discuss the scores during the interviews. That doesn't lead to anything. It just, because people feel attacked, they start defending, you know, why are you giving a 3? I think we are a 4, etc. And you don't, it is all wasted time, basically, because you don't learn anymore. Just ask open questions and you know, relate what the answer that you're getting to the counter evidence and the evidences. And the second tip is these numbers threaten, of course, to start a life of their own if they get into the wrong hands, you know. So the goal has to be always kept in mind that what we're trying to do here is identify the areas where we can do better. And those, of course, are the areas with the lowest scores. Those are the important ones. The ones with high scores, people might find those more interesting, but actually, you know, you're already doing quite well there. And so focus on the minimums. Actually, you can look at some of these behaviors, and some of them are really indicative of doing more upfront design, and some of them are really indicative of doing more agile architecture. And we did a little analysis of you know, where people were sitting in that spectrum, or the teams were sitting in that spectrum from Agile Outback to Waterfall Wasteland, and how they would score. And what you would expect, of course, was that those who had a balanced approach would score higher on average. And that's actually what we measured. You see this little sort of V-like shape here, where actually those teams that had that did take all of the responsibilities on both sides seriously actually had a much better maturity level overall than the teams that had straight into the Agile Outback or the Waterfall Wasteland. Yeah. So here are some references. And I guess, oh, I thought I had a slide with questions, please, but I guess I'll just, why don't I go back to this one as a summary.
Actually,